The wild stallion. It was a black stallion. His fur glistened in the sunlight. He was grazing in the shade of a hazel bush by the bank of the mill stream. It seemed as if he hadn't noticed them yet. But after Alex had swallowed his anger and, not to betray its presence, pointed silently at the animal, Freddie went completely crazy. "Hey, there's the horse! Come on, let's get him! Giddy up, Pascal!" And off he galloped. Alex followed reluctantly. He would have preferred to have tried a more careful approach to the animal, but it was too late for that now. The black horse threw himself sideways, spooked as he caught sight of the others. He was quite young, not very big, and bursting with strength and wild energy. His long mane hung down far below his neck. He reared up loudly, then bolted off to the north at a stretched gallop. Bibi and Tina eyed the surroundings attentively as they trotted along. Apart from a few bushes near the stream, there was nothing special to see, let alone a horse, until it suddenly appeared on the horizon. Amadeus and Sabrina pulled back as the wild horse raced on. It was a black stallion, galloping towards them at high speed and followed close behind by two riders, Alex and Freddie. When the horse noticed them, it stopped abruptly. "Hooray! We're gonna take him in!" cried Freddie. "He must be crazy," Bibi hissed angrily at Tina. There was no need to rush the animal like that. The black horse now bounced nervously, prancing in a circle, desperately searching for a way out. He abruptly broke out sideways and made towards the rose hedge. He couldn't jump over it. It was too high and too wide. But with his sharp eyes, he had discovered a narrow passage. Behind it was a dirt road to the quarry. At a full gallop, the stallion headed for it and quickly disappeared a moment later. "He's galloping to the quarry," cried Tina. "Yeah, we'll get him there," yelled Freddie, but Alex snapped at him angrily. "Stop rushing the horse, Freddie. You're gonna make him fall." Freddie hadn't heard Alex take this tone before and cast him a somewhat bewildered look. But Alex was right. Freddie saw that immediately. The stallion ran straight for the steep face of the quarry. "All right," he muttered, holding Pascal back. "I'm riding ahead." Tina now took the lead. "Giddy up, Amadeus." At a light gallop, the four followed the fleeing horse. As they approached the quarry, they slowed their pace, dismounted, and wrapped the reins around the bare branches of a dead tree. The black stallion stood right at the edge of the quarry, his head lowered, neck long, as if he was checking how to somehow get down. But the rock face dropped almost vertically, and the stallion saw that he could not get any further at this point. He danced about nervously, causing a boulder to come loose and rumble down into the quarry below. The horse snorted in fright and turned in the direction of the children. "Whoa!" cried Tina reassuringly. "Oh!" Carefully, she moved towards him, step by gentle step. She took an oatmeal treat from her pocket and held it out to the nervous animal. "Oh, my dear," repeated Tina. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you." The stallion snorted wildly, his nostrils flared. Again and again he struck the stony ground with his front hooves. Tina was only a few steps away from him. With utmost deliberation, she reached her hand even closer with the treat. "Look what I have for you." The horse stood perfectly still, stretching his head forward ever so slightly. As Tina took one more step towards the horse, she hadn't noticed the scrawny branch just beneath her foot. A sharp crack resounded, echoing through the silence of the quarry. The black stallion reared on his hind legs and released a terrified whinny. Tina froze in horror as the horse's hooves hovered dangerously close above her. At that moment, Bibi's voice cut in. "Plop, stop! Whiz, whiz!" followed by a pling-pling sound. Illuminated stars whirled between Tina and the horse's hooves, which all at once floated motionless in the air. It seemed like an eternity before Tina finally jumped aside. "Tina, are you all right?" Alex immediately rushed towards his girlfriend. Bibi followed close behind. Nobody paid attention to the black stallion at that moment. Bibi's distress call had only frozen him for a few seconds, and now he rushed past Tina with a tremendous leap. "Nothing happened to me," she cried. "Quick, we must go after him." The stallion galloped back to the path where they had come. Bibi, Tina, and Alex hurriedly untied their horses and jumped into the saddle. Freddie was already in pursuit. When he had seen that Tina had escaped the horror, he had not wasted another second hesitating. He gripped tightly onto Pascal's neck and chased after the fleeing stallion. "Go, Pascal!" he cried. "Step on it!" Despite this strange command, Pascal understood exactly what Freddie wanted. He seemed to be flying across the meadow. They still couldn't get near the fleeing stallion, but Freddie knew he had a chance. They were approaching the road. One car after the other drove by, and the black stallion was too nervous to cross. That's what Freddie was counting on. At a furious gallop, he unhooked the lasso off the saddle. He'd done this often enough with his buddies, but all they'd ever done was throw at sticks they'd stuck in the ground. To his own surprise, this made little difference. Freddie swung the lasso and let go. The rope swirled through the air, over the black stallion's head, and dropped straight down around his broad neck. "Yes!" cried Freddie triumphantly, clenching his fist. "I caught him!" The black stallion whinnied loudly as he felt the lasso around his neck, his hooves pounding through the air. He tried to get away, but Freddie grabbed the lasso with both hands. "Tie it!" yelled Alex, who had followed Freddie with Bibi and Tina. "Tie him up!" Freddie didn't understand what Alex meant. What was he tying up? To what? He stared hypnotized at the lasso, which suddenly began to stretch. Freddie felt a powerful jolt which ripped him from Pascal with immense force. Fortunately, the ground was soaked from the rain and quite soft. The horse dragged him through the meadow on his stomach, directly towards the mill stream, but letting go of the lasso was out of the question for Freddie. Suddenly he understood what Alex had meant by tie him up. Of course, he would have had to tie the lasso around the saddle. Bibi, Tina, and Alex had followed Freddie's involuntary slide with stunned horror at first. When the fleeing stallion was only a few lengths away from the stream, Tina snapped out of her paralysis. "Bibi, do something!" she shouted to her friend. Bibi had also regained her composure and had already raised her hands. "I'm already on it," she murmured, and cried out, "Eeny, meeny, motor Freddy, wild stallion, hold thee steady, whiz, whiz!" Little witches' stars danced from Bibi's fingers, followed by a bright pling-pling sound. At once, the stallion stopped, but Freddy's slide wasn't over yet. He had so much momentum that he just kept sliding, right past the horse until... "Hurrah!" cried Freddy. Below him, he could see his own warbled reflection in the mill stream. His head was hanging over the embankment, and, luckily, his rodeo-style slide stopped there just in time for him to avoid falling in. "Phew!" Freddy exhaled with relief. The lasso end slipped from his hands. He picked himself up and took a few careful steps. Nothing seemed to be broken, and he was not hurt. Bibi, Tina, and Alex erupted with excitement. Alex jumped off his horse, immediately grabbed the lasso lying on the ground, and wrapped it around the horn of his saddle. Bibi and Tina took care of Freddy in the meantime. "Are you all right?" Bibi asked. Freddy slowly looked down at himself. "I guess so, more or less." "That looked awful," cried Tina. "Why didn't you just let go?" "No way," Freddy smiled again. "It wasn't that bad. Luckily, the meadow is still wet. It was like sliding down a slide, and the horse didn't even drag me through the mill stream." "You have Bibi to thank for that," said Tina. "She cast a spell." Freddy tapped Bibi lightly on the shoulder. "Thanks, Bibi. Thank you. But maybe..." He looked down at himself again and spread his arms. "Perhaps you could cast another one to clean me up a little?" Freddy did look terrible. His clothes were soaking wet and covered with grass and mud. Only his hat was untouched, sitting impeccably on his head. "All right." Bibi turned to Freddy and lifted her arms. "Eeny, meeny, quarry scarp, now the sheriff's looking sharp. Whiz, whiz." No sooner had the witch stars faded when Freddy's clothes were as clean and fresh as if he'd just walked out of a Wild West store. Alex joined them with Maharaja on the reins. "What are we going to do with him now?" he asked, pointing his head at the black stallion who was now grazing in peace. At this very moment, the animal looked up curiously. as if it had understood the question. Although the black horse was now completely calm, you could feel the power and ferocity brewing within him. His eyes looked fiery, his fur silky. For a few moments, no one said anything. They were all enchanted by this beautiful horse. "We'll take him to Martin's farm," Tina finally said. "Then we'll see." Thanks to Bibi's quick thinking, the stallion joined them without resisting. Everyone was relieved when they finally reached Martin's farm without further incident. Police at Martin's farm. Mrs. Martin saw Bibi, Tina, Alex, and Freddie come back through the kitchen window. "What's this about?" she wondered, seeing that Alex had lassoed a strange horse. Mrs. Martin hurried out. "That's a beautiful horse," she said, approaching the animal with utmost curiosity. "Look out, Mama," Tina warned her. "He's dangerous." Indeed, when Mrs. Martin came too close to the stallion, he snorted irritably and threw his head up. "It's all right." Mrs. Martin took a step back and turned to her daughter. "Where did you get him?" Tina recounted to her the events leading up to when they caught the horse. Alex, Freddie, and Bibi did not spare any details either, and so it took quite a long time before Mrs. Martin understood the whole story. "Now the only question is, who does the horse actually belong to?" Tina ended. "Yes, and what should we do with him until we find the owner?" Mrs. Martin added thoughtfully. Bibi already had an answer to this. "We'll just put him up at Martin's farm. Please, Mrs. Martin?" Tina's mother nodded. "There's nothing else we can do anyway." "I wouldn't let the horse into the barn," Freddie objected. "He'll break your stall." So it was decided to put the stallion in the paddock. It was no problem to lead him inside, but once there, he threw his head back and forth and tried to get rid of the lasso by any means possible. Bibi couldn't watch this any longer and climbed over the fence. The stallion snorted wildly as she approached him. "Careful, Bibi," cried Tina. "I just want to undo the lasso." Bibi turned to Mrs. Martin. "Can I free him?" Fortunately, Mrs. Martin agreed, and Bibi raised her arms. "Eeny, meeny, mane of steed, lassoed stallion now be freed. Whiz, whiz." The witch's pling-pling resounded across the farm, and in a flash, Freddie held the lasso in his hand. The black stallion had flinched from Bibi's glowing stars, but when he noticed that she had freed him, he whinnied happily and galloped jauntily across the paddock. The children could have watched him forever, but they also had to take care of the other horses on Martin's farm. "When you finish the cleaning and grooming, please come in," said Mrs. Martin, and went back into the house. "There's cocoa and fresh butter cake." The four of them had just led the horses outside into the sun when they heard the sound of an engine approaching. A car slipped through the gate and came to a quick stop, but this was no ordinary vehicle. It was a police car. "I'll be darned," Freddie scratched his head. "The mill farmer called the cops on you." "I don't believe it." Tina was upset. The driver's door opened, and a very comfy-looking officer got out. He had a round head and a small mustache. "Good afternoon. I am Chief Ted Limberkind," he introduced himself and smiled politely. "And who are you?" "I am Tina Martin," Tina replied and went briskly towards him. "And just so you know, Mr. Limberkind, it wasn't a horse from Martin's farm." "That's right." Bibi stepped next to her and put her hands on her hips. "The mill farmer was mistaken." "But we've already caught the horse," Freddie explained, self-assuredly, and stood beside the two girls. Alex also chimed in. "And in any case, it's out of the question for Martin's farm to pay for any damages." What are you talking about?" Chief Ted Limberkin blinked in confusion. "Damages?" he repeated carefully. "Is there some crime here I don't know about?" At that moment, Mrs. Martin came out of the house. After greeting the policeman, she asked him, "Please tell us what this is all about." "Yes, well," the man said, "it's about a horse." "A black stallion?" Tina asked. "Yes, indeed." Chief Limberkin looked suspiciously at her under his bushy eyebrows. "How do you know that?" "Well, because we caught him." "You did?" Suddenly, the policeman was beaming all over his face and his eyes were shining. "That's wonderful! Can I see him?" They all accompanied the chief to the paddock where the stallion was grazing peacefully. "Yes, that must be the horse," muttered the policeman. "It looks exactly as Mr. Brown described it." Now he wanted to know how and under what circumstances the horse had arrived at Martin's farm. "That is a longer story," replied Mrs. Martin, and since it was time for afternoon coffee anyway, she invited the chief into the house. He accepted, visibly pleased. Over cocoa and butter cake, Bibi, Tina, Freddie, and Alex reported how they had caught the wild stallion. "Amazing! That's quite impressive! Very well done," praised the policeman as they finished their story. "I don't know how I would have found him without you. Mr. Brown will be very grateful." "Is that the owner of the horse?" Tina asked. "Yes, that's him." Chief Limberkin nodded, took a sip of coffee, and began his report. Last night, in the middle of the biggest storm, a completely soaked man had appeared at the Falkenstein police station. His horse had just broken out of the horse trailer, he reported. The man's name was Tom Brown. He was American and ran a western ranch near Redwell together with his German wife. The horse was an American Mustang called Geronimo, and Mr. Brown had bought him during his last trip to Wyoming. Geronimo arrived at the airport yesterday. Mr. Brown had picked him up and was going to take him to Redwell in his horse trailer, but on the way, the animal had escaped during the storm. "So, those are the facts." Chief Limberkin interrupted his report only to have another piece of Mrs. Martin's butter cake. After he had swallowed an enormous bite, he continued. "Mr. Brown has warned me explicitly that it would not be easy to catch this horse again, for it is a most unusual animal." Geronimo had been raised in a free-range Mustang herd, and after he was captured, lived on a ranch with other captive wild horses. Mr. Brown had discovered him there and arranged the transport to his ranch after buying him. But in order to use Geronimo as a steed, he would have to adjust to his new surroundings and be carefully broken in. When Chief Limberkin had finished telling the story, Mrs. Martin asked, "What's going to happen to Geronimo now?" "Well," the chief explained, "I will inform Mr. Brown. He will get in touch with you and pick up the horse. Then the case is closed." He rubbed his hands in satisfaction. "If you'll excuse me, I really must be going." After the good-natured police chief got into his car and drove off, Mrs. Martin returned to her work. Bibi, Tina, Freddie, and Alex returned to the horses, as they had still not finished cleaning. While they groomed and scraped out hooves, they talked about the news they had just heard. They were dealing with a wild American Mustang. "I think Geronimo is a beautiful horse," enthused Bibi. "But do you know what that name means?" "Sure." Freddie, of course, already knew. "You know these things." Freddie wasn't particularly well educated, but he read a lot of Western literature and had gained quite a bit of knowledge in the process. "Geronimo was a Native American," he said, "a renowned warrior of the Apache tribe. For his freedom, he and some of his people fought for years against the U.S. Army. Though they outnumbered him, the Army just couldn't get him, no matter how hard they tried. Geronimo kept getting away and would continue to fight." Bibi was lost in her thoughts. The black stallion had also been born a wild horse. She would have liked best if he could have roamed the American prairie freely forever. But now he was here on Martin's farm. Bibi felt an irresistible desire to ride this horse, just once. When she told the others, Tina warned her, "I wouldn't touch him, Bibi." Freddie agreed. "Even I wouldn't dare go near Geronimo again. I mean, we're lucky we even caught him and—" But Freddie was interrupted by the phone ringing in the house. The friends paused their conversation to listen in on Mrs. Martin through the open window. "Oh, good afternoon, Mr. Brown," she announced happily. Bibi, Tina, Freddie, and Alex pricked up their ears, but they didn't get to hear much. "You're welcome, Mr. Brown. Yes, everything is fine." "Good. I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye, Mr. Brown." That's about all Mrs. Martin said before coming out to meet the kids. "Well, what did this Mr. Brown say?" Tina wanted to know. "That he'll come by in the morning with his trailer and pick up Geronimo," Mrs. Martin replied. "He's very glad that you were able to catch him, and above all that he is well. He asked us to be careful for our own safety. Geronimo may seem a bit used to people, but he is still a wild horse, so beware, children." "I'm not going near this guy anymore, not if I don't have to," laughed Freddie. "Besides, I have to get home. Can I come back tomorrow? I want to see Geronimo being picked up." "Sure," nodded Tina and smiled at him. Freddie beamed back. "Great. And how about we take a ride on my machine then, Tina? We could go to Falkenstein and have some ice cream." When Alex heard that, he bit his lips. Freddie was really pushy. He definitely made a pass at Tina, but she'd probably give him a salty rebuff right away. "I'd love to," said Tina. "That'll be fun." Alex's chin dropped, while Freddie nodded confidently as if he expected no other response. After he got back into his motocross gear, he got on his bike and shouted, "Well, see you tomorrow," before roaring away out of the yard. Tina waved after him. Turning to Bibi, she said, "Actually, Freddie's a pretty cool guy, isn't he? I think I've always underestimated him." Alex broke into a coughing fit. "Besides, he's a guy you can count on," Tina went on, giving Alex a sideways glance. "Unlike a certain count's son." Alex ran red as he drilled a pebble into the ground with the heel of his boot. He said, I'm going home now, too." He hoped Tina would hold him back, or at least say something nice to say goodbye, but she didn't. "Okay," that's all she said. Alex took a deep breath. "I can't come tomorrow morning. I mean, when Geronimo gets picked up," he stuttered. Yes, I know," Tina replied, indifferently. "Come, let's take the horses to the stable." She turned to Bibi. Tina took Amadeus and Pascal by the reins while Bibi led her mare, Sabrina. "Well, goodbye," Alex stammered, but Tina didn't seem to hear him anymore. With shoulders slumped low, Alex shuffled to Maharaja and climbed up. He knew he should hurry back to Falkenstein Castle, as his father was quite strict about eating dinner together on time. But Alex didn't feel like hustling at all. He simply wasn't in the mood to gallop. Tina had turned him down, cold as ice. Alex still couldn't believe it as he trotted slowly away from Martin's farm. As he rode through the courtyard gate, Bibi said to her friend, "Did you really have to do that, Tina? The poor thing's hurt." But Tina just shrugged her shoulders, unmoved. "Come on," she said. "He can stew a little bit longer." Apples for Geronimo. It was evening at the farm. The animals were hungry and had to be fed. Mrs. Martin looked after the cows and chickens, while Bibi and Tina looked after the horses. When they had finished, Bibi filled a ladle of oats and pellets into a metal bucket. She walked with the bucket to the gate of the paddock and put it there. "Come, Geronimo," she beckoned. "I brought you some food." Bibi lifted the bucket, but the horse only shifted its head for a moment before turning his back to her. Geronimo seemed to have no interest in the food or Bibi. But she didn't give up so easily. Bibi had an idea. There must still be plenty of apples in the orchard from the tree that Freddie had felled, she thought. I'll bet Geronimo would love them. She climbed over the fence and ran to the east garden, where she grabbed some apples and stuffed them into her pockets. Then she slipped back into the paddock and slowly walked towards Geronimo. "Look," she cried, holding up a particularly nice red apple. The stallion raised his head. His ears twitched slightly. "This one's for you." Bibi stopped, threw the apple in the air, and caught it again. This aroused Geronimo's curiosity, and he slowly started to move. He stopped only a few lengths away from Bibi, stretched out his neck, and eyed the apple. Bibi could literally feel his thought process. Should I or shouldn't I? She took a step towards Geronimo and held the apple under his nose. All he had to do was grab it. But instead, he blew a gust of air through his nostrils and threw his head back proudly before trotting leisurely over to the center of the paddock. Bibi was disappointed. "Really? You arrogant bronco!" she shouted angrily. She climbed outside over the paddock fence and leaned against it, sulking. "Stupid horse," she thought. "I don't care one way or the other." But then it dawned on Bibi that she would never gain Geronimo's trust that way, which she came to the conclusion was exactly what she wanted. Her contemplation was at once interrupted by a light touch on her shoulder. "Geronimo!" While she was turned away, not looking at him, the stallion had come closer to give her a nudge with his soft nostrils. Now he was standing right in front of her, not an arm's length away. "Would you like an apple now?" Bibi hurried to get one out of her pocket. This time, Geronimo took the apple from her hand. He seemed really hungry, seeing as how he was chomping one full apple after another. Bibi watched him with immense gratitude. "Yes, you like them, my dear, don't you?" She could not resist the temptation to stroke Geronimo and slowly reached out her hand. Sensing her approach, the stallion retreated immediately. He calmly stepped back out into the middle of the paddock, where he stood motionless, as if he was looking thoughtfully into the distance. The sun was already hanging low over the treetops of Falkenstein forest. It would soon disappear completely, though a pale and perfectly round, full moon had appeared in the dusky evening sky. The air had cooled considerably, and Bibi shivered, but she felt that something important had happened. Geronimo had taken food from her. Even if he didn't quite trust her yet, they had come a little closer. Geronimo was also a topic of conversation at dinner. Bibi told the others that he had eaten out of her hand, but Mrs. Martin dampened her enthusiasm. "Geronimo is still a wild animal, Bibi. Maybe he has already got used to you a bit, but in an emergency, he obeys his instincts, so please be careful. Geronimo will certainly make a wonderful riding horse one day, but until then, it's going to take a lot of patience." "I hope that Mr. Brown has that much patience," said Tina, biting her cheese sandwich. Mrs. Martin nodded confidently. "I had the impression on the phone that Geronimo is very near and dear to him." "Well, if nothing more happens tonight, he can take him away in the morning," Tina said. "What could happen?" Bibi interjected. "Horses are flight animals, Bibi," Mrs. Martin explained. "And as I said, Geronimo's instincts are very strong. After all, he has run away before. If something frightens him, it can happen again." Bibi became absorbed in thought. She bit into a pickle and chewed on it for a while, before finally suggesting, "Tina, how about we sleep upstairs in the hayloft tonight? I mean, the paddock's right next door, and we could step in if anything happens to Geronimo." "Isn't it too cold to sleep in the barn?" Mrs. Martin objected. After all, it was October, but Bibi and Tina assured her that with sleeping bags and blankets, they could make a warm, comfortable camp in the hay. "Besides, tonight is a full moon," Bibi added meaningfully. "Wild animals react to this, and you said yourself that instincts are very strong with Geronimo." "Really? Well, if you think the full moon could be dangerous," Mrs. Martin smiled. In any case, she no longer objected to the two girls sleeping in the hayloft. So Bibi and Tina brought their sleeping bags, blankets, a flashlight, and a packet of biscuits to the stable and settled down on the top of the hayloft. An hour later, Martin's farm was bathed in evening darkness. Through the gable window of the stables, the faint ray of their flashlight escaped into the night sky. Bibi lay on her back, her head leaning on her forearm. "Ah, what could be better?" she sighed happily. She looked at Tina with satisfaction. "I'm so happy to be sleeping here in the hayloft again," she said. "This will probably be the last time this year." Her friend Tina, however, seemed anything but happy. On the contrary, she looked rather downhearted. "Tina, what's wrong?" Bibi inquired nervously, but suddenly she knew. "It's Alex, isn't it?" Tina just nodded. "That stupid guy," she said. "He doesn't care about me at all." She looked sadly at her friend. "Alex was pretty jealous today, I think," said Bibi. "And I think he had reason to be." "Alex? Jealous? Jealous of what?" Tina pretended to be completely clueless. "And of whom? Really?" "Well, Freddie, of course. You and the sheriff were getting along pretty well today." When Tina heard that, she laughed out loud. But then she said softly, "If it's true that Alex is jealous, he might still be interested in me, don't you think?" Bibi shook her head. Really, Tina, she said wholeheartedly. Of course Alex is interested in you. Anyone can see that. You think so? I'm certain of it. Tina lay back down, her thoughts racing. Then she finally turned off the flashlight. After a while, Bibi heard her voice. I feel much better now, Tina said. Bibi smiled. Good night, Tina. Good night, Bibi. Soon both girls were asleep. Though all the lights were out, the luminescent moon cast an ethereal glow over the entire courtyard of Martin's farm. A daring plan. Count Falco von Falkenstein strolled up and down in his rose garden after dinner. He loved to enjoy the flower's beauty after the day's troubles, as he would often say. A faint patter of hooves echoed around the Count's ear. His son Alexander soon trotted through the castle gates, then dismounted before coming towards him with Maharaja. Good evening, father, he said, rather sheepishly. Count Falco raised his eyebrows. How nice that the prodigal son is finally coming home, he said with reprehension in his voice. Unfortunately, I had to dine tonight without your esteemed presence. I'm sorry, father, Alex replied. I was with Tina. After that greeting, Alex had no desire to explain to his father what had happened today and why he was late. He didn't mention the Geronimo incident or the fight with Tina. I can see that it's late, the Count resumed. He pulled out his gold pocket watch, let it snap open, and studied it for a moment before continuing. You realize that the kitchen is already closed? If you are hungry, you will have to prepare something for yourself. Yes, father, Alex nodded. I'll take Maharaja to the stable first. 1 moment, please, Count Falco frowned even more. The workmen will arrive tomorrow morning at 8, as you may recall. I advise you to be on time for once. I repeat, on time. Alex nodded again. Yes, father. He led Maharaja to the stable. All he wanted now was to be left alone. When Harry, the stableman, grumpily offered to take care of Maharaja, Alex waved him off. Thank you, Harry. I'll do it myself. Wouldn't you like something to eat first? The groom asked more politely. I'm not hungry, Alex replied. You can call it a day. Harry smiled gratefully at him and left the stable. Alex really wasn't hungry. The quarrel with Tina, their unpleasant farewell, the equally unpleasant greeting from his father, and the prospect of tomorrow, all this thoroughly spoiled his appetite. To clean and groom Maharaja would hopefully lift his spirits a bit. He unsaddled his stallion and set to work. The routine, even strokes with the brush and mane comb, the smell and closeness of the horse, there was always something calming about these combined movements. But today it was different. Alex was unfocused and nervous, and Maharaja felt that. Again and again he gave an irritated snort. I'm sorry, my dear, Alex apologized. I don't know what's wrong with me either. He finished his duties, gave Maharaja his ration of oats, and left the stable. He decided to read a little more and then go to bed early. But first he had to say goodnight to his father, also something that Count Falco von Falkenstein attached great importance to. In the meantime, the Count had said goodbye to his roses and returned back to his study. He wanted to check the cost estimate from the roofing company, which he had received earlier during the day. At that moment, there was a knock on the door as Alexander hesitantly entered the study. The Count looked up from his documents. Yes, what is it? I just wanted to say goodnight to you, Alex replied. So early? Well then, good night, my son. Good night, father. Alex wanted to close the door again. Alexander? Count Falco took off his monocle and looked at his son with a good eye. What's wrong with you, Alexander? You don't seem quite yourself today. Alex sensed that his father actually meant well, offering to help him in his own parental way. But he was not in the mood to talk now and shook his head somewhat defiantly. Everything's fine, father. It's just a few problems with Tina, he added. Ah, such is love. An amused smile appeared on the Count's lips. Yes, I get it. I mean to say, I've been no stranger to such feelings, on occasion, he added, nodding encouragingly at his son. The attempt to cheer him up didn't seem to have been entirely successful, however, as Alex's thoughts remained serious and closed. "Yes, Father," he said, "of course, you're right." But he wasn't dismissed yet. "Alexander," said Count Falco, this time in a more deliberate voice, "if you have something on your mind that you would like to discuss with me, I am here for you." "Thank you, Father, but for the moment there's no need," Alex replied. "As you wish." And now Alex closed the door for good. Count Falco put his monocle back on and looked around, pondering for a while. "Oh yes, the sweet sorrows of youth," he murmured, sinking into his own recollections for a while longer. After he had showered, brushed his teeth, and put on pajamas, Alex went straight to his room. He stood indecisively in front of the bookshelf for quite a while, until he finally pulled out a book about horse breeds. In it, there was also a chapter about American Mustangs. Alex read that Mustangs were descendants of thoroughbreds, a majestic, noble horse breed left behind by Spanish settlers in America during the 16th century. Through their free life in the wilderness, they had developed into incredibly strong, tough, and fast horses. They lived in herds led by an alpha mare and were sociable, playful, and intelligent. They had rock-hard hooves with which they could defend themselves against any enemy and did not need shoeing. Alex looked up from the book. He thought of Freddie because he had discovered that Geronimo was unshod. Yeah, Freddie had been at the top of his game today. Alex had to admit that. Tina had also gotten along with him very well, while she had hardly paid any attention at all to Alex. She was mad at him about the roofing work, but why didn't she understand how important it was to keep Falkenstein Castle in top condition at all times, Alex wondered. After all, the castle had been in the family for over 750 years. Alex shook his head, his thoughts having taken him by surprise. He was still holding the book on horse breeds, and so he read on. The noble characteristics of the Mustangs had made them very popular with the Native Americans, and also later with the cowboys. Because of their free life in the prairie, however, they had become extremely headstrong and proud animals whose trust was difficult to win. They had to be carefully tamed and broken in, but once they had put their trust in someone, they were the most loyal and best companions one could ever wish for. And so the chapter ended. Alex closed the book and put it back on the shelf. He decided to go to bed, knowing otherwise he would only have a mess of thoughts keeping him awake. Tomorrow, the world would look wondrous and new again, or so he hoped. Alex crawled under the covers and closed his eyes, but immediately the day's events came rushing back. The fight with Tina at the old oak, how Freddie had explained to him that he thought he was a wimp, that he had no guts, and how this brazen fellow had also told him, man to man, that he intended to have a date with Tina. Alex's heart suddenly beat faster. He wondered if Tina thought he was a wimp too, and if she thought he didn't have guts either. She had replied, "I'd love to, it'll be fun," when Freddie asked her out. Alex tried to calm down, but Freddie was no wimp. He certainly had courage and determination. He could even lasso a fleeing Mustang. What did Tina say? Freddie's actually a pretty cool guy? She said that, didn't she? Alex couldn't stay in bed any longer. He threw the blanket back and got up, walking restlessly over to the window. The full moon was shining bright in the night sky. Alex forced himself to take several deep breaths until his thoughts finally calmed. He had to talk to Tina. Yes, tonight. He'd get on Maharaja and ride to Martin's farm, right now. He'd throw little stones at Tina's window and explain everything until they made up. But would Tina even open the window if she saw him? Alex clenched his hands into fists. No, he decided. He had to give Tina a good reason to miss out on that ride with Freddie. Alex remembered how coldly she'd treated him when they said goodbye. She had nearly dumped him outright. Alex stared desperately up at the full moon. What could he do? As he stood there, he remembered what he had just read. Mustangs need to be tamed and broken in, he muttered, lost in thought. Freddie's words came back to him. Even I wouldn't dare go near that Geronimo again. That's what Freddie had said. All of a sudden, everything came together, like puzzle pieces forming a complete picture. A plan began to take shape in Alex's mind. A daring plan. If he carried it out, no one would ever call him a wimp and say he didn't have guts again. And if he threw pebbles at Tina's window then, she would surely open it. 2 hours later, while the Count was fast asleep, the door to Alexander's room quietly opened. He stepped out into the hall. Alex was wearing his riding clothes, holding his boots in his hand. On tiptoe, he crept down the corridor, past his father's bedroom, and down the stairs into the hall. Shortly after he had left the castle, he put his boots on and ran across the courtyard to the stable, where he pushed open the creaking door and slipped inside. Maharaja snorted excitedly as Alex saddled and bridled him. "Shh, Maharaja," Alex whispered and patted his neck. When the horse had calmed down, he led it out of the stable by the bridle through the heavy iron castle gate. Only then did he mount his great black stallion. "Go, Maharaja!" The noble, thoroughbred Arabian galloped off. Alex could find his way to Martin's farm in his sleep. When he reached the front entrance, however, he did not lead Maharaja through the courtyard gate as usual, but rode onwards along the dirt road that led past the farm. Right next to the paddock, he dismounted and tied Maharaja to the fence. Geronimo had stretched out on the ground between the two trees in the middle of the paddock. Was he asleep? "You'll be wide awake soon," Alex thought, and climbed over the fence. Determined, he tread carefully towards the wild Mustang.